I'm using 140-pound Arches paper. The first thing I'm doing is wetting the back of the paper, making sure it's thoroughly wet, spreading it across evenly. If you leave it for a minute or two and then flip it, that'll prevent some of the buckling. Now I'm taping down my paper, lay it smooth, and paint all four sides. Once the paper is taped down, I am spraying it just because it's easier, but wetting the front side as well. Make sure it's even but not pooling. Then you're going to create the main color. We're doing the first one in a monochromatic theme. So I am using ultramarine blue, adding indigo, a little bit of alizarian crimson, and some burnt sienna. Make sure that you make plenty of this mixture, and you want to have enough of it so that you can do the entire painting and not run out. So lift up your page, put it at an angle. I'm just making sure everything is wet. And then I'm going to use a mop brush. I'm using a 3/4 inch. Basically use a bigger brush, whatever is more comfortable for you. You'll find if you go with too small a brush, you'll start getting a lot of streaking. So start at the top and then re-dip with every 1 or 2 strokes. Make sure to overlap the previous line. And as you can see, I have a bead that's bleeding down the page because it's wet. Just as long as that keeps doing it, you're great. I'm just wiping any of the excess that's running down just to prevent the mess. Then I'm just adding a bit more at the bottom because it's not quite as dark as I'd like. I'm going to work it up a bit. And then I'm going to start at the top because I still see it's very dark at the top and I see some streaks. And my paint is still very wet, so I can go back and I can redo it without doing any damage to the painting. So I'm doing it the same way. I'm taking my paint and I'm overlapping. Now I'm not re-dipping every time because I'm just trying to even it out a little bit. Going to wipe the bottom again just to make sure it's clean and clean off the sides. So now I'm going to take a smaller brush and I'm just going to wet it. So this is just clean water. And I'm just putting a drip at the top of the page and then running it through lightly and lifting my brush as I go down so that the stream becomes much narrower as it goes to the bottom. I'm going to keep repeating this because at the top I want it to be whiter. I don't want to lift all the paint, but I do want the top to be brighter and lighter, because that is closer to where the light reflection is coming from. So what I have to do is keep cleaning my brush, and I can just run it through the stripe, but I have to make sure I keep wiping it on the paper towel to take off the excess paint, because as I lift the color, I am lifting paint, and if I don't remove it on the paper towel, well, then it's just going to keep spreading it and I won't get the desired effect. I keep my board angled throughout the process, so as I'm adding water, it just keeps running down and fading. And if it goes right to the bottom of the page, just grab a tissue and just wipe it to prevent any excess. The next step, I am just taking my fingers, dipping them in the water, and I'm taking off the excess, wiping it on the cup, and then I just sort of splash my page by flicking my fingers. And it's a judgment call as to how much you're going to do. You don't want to overdo it, and you don't want any big splashes, but you want enough so that you get a nice effect. Then take a plastic card or a spatula, and you're going to draw your lines up towards a vanishing point. So think of it as a 1-point perspective. So everything is going to go towards one spot. So I am just pulling my card up, and I'm just using the corner of the plastic card. And you have to make sure your page is still wet, because if it's too dry, this isn't going to work. And if it's too wet, everything will bleed back in. So I just splashed a bit more water because I didn't have enough of the blossoming effect that I was looking for. Now I'm taking white gouache and really watering it down. I'm using a liner brush and just flicking it against my hand, and you'll see it splatters on. Now it looks like it is white, but it's not. I'm using the white gouache so watered down, but when it dries, it's just transparent little circles. So I'm adding a bit more because when it dried, I realized I didn't have enough of them. And as you see, with the drying time, you can see the little drops, but they're not white. You do not want them white. You just want to use the white to give you a transparent circle. And you're just wiping off the board because the back of the paper is still going to be wet. The reason we wet it is so that it will allow me to move quickly without everything drying out. Now I realized I had forgot to put some texture, so what I'm doing is I've just got a fan brush and I am dry brushing just in a few areas across the painting just to give you a little bit of texture. Now I've already prepared my paper with the water the same as I did for the very first painting. For our second image, we're going to be using different colors to represent a street light reflected on the road. So I'm using alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow, and a green that is a combination of phthalo green and ultramarine. What you want to make sure is that your board is on an angle and that you are heavily pigmenting the color. You don't want it faded because then the color will disappear by the end of the process. Once you get your three colors on your paper, you want to make sure they dry completely. So the paper will still remain wet because we've painted the water on the back and no air is getting to it. But we do need to dry our pigment, so you can take a blow dryer or you can just wait. But you do want the pigments dry before you go on with the next step. I'm now creating the same blue that I used in the previous image, which was my ultramarine, indigo, alizarin crimson, and burnt sienna. Again, you have to make sure you make plenty of this. Otherwise, if you run out, you're going to come into problems and complications when you're just trying to finish the painting. Then do a wash and keep your board at an angle. And as you see, I'm lifting it up to make mine even more severe so that the paint will start to run from the top of the page to the bottom, allowing it to fade at the top and to be deeper at the bottom when it dries. So as you can see, I have a really nice dark wash, and I'm just making it even out a bit. Then once you finish, I've got it at the angle, so what will happen is the blue will run down, but I'm going to do, as I did in the previous painting, take a smaller brush with clean water, and I'm just going to do the drips right from the top. So the method is exactly the same, but we've done an underpainting in this case. So this is why you want to remember where you painted your colors, because you want them to show through as you start to drip the water down. Make sure to keep cleaning your brush and adding more clear water until you are happy with the visibility. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure the blue paint is still wet while you are trying to do this. Otherwise, you won't get the really nice soft bleed at the edge of each of the reflections. You'll notice I keep working just at the top and just pulling a little through about halfway. You want the top of your painting to be brighter and clearer, and you just want the paint to fade out and the line to go very narrow as it goes down the page. As soon as you're finished with your reflections and the paint is still wet, you want to flick the water on it again to try and get some little blooms which will look like puddles or the rain splattering off the ground. So this is exactly as in the first. I am now taking my plastic card and I'm drawing some lines, bringing them up to my vanishing point. And I do a couple of them just because it looks nicer and more realistic. Now I'm adding some more splashes because, as you see, once it dried, I didn't get as many blooms. So it'll still give me blooms, they just won't be as strong. Now this is where I'm going to add the texture in, which I'd forgotten to in the first one and went back and did it. But I usually do it before I put the white gouache on. So I'm just going to go up and down until I'm happy. You don't want to go and add so much that it just looks like a bunch of lines. You just want to make it so that you have some reflections and some texture and it all works together. So when you think you've done enough, then just stop. I know it appears that I'm doing a lot of this, but I'm using an old fan brush that I've actually cut some bristles out, and I'm doing it with it fairly dry, so very little is coming off, as you can see. So I just keep going. And then once I finish, I'm using the watered down gouache and I'm spattering it again. You can see it looks white, but when it dries, it will be transparent. So I'm now removing my tape, and then I'm going to lift up my painting because the back of it will still be wet. So I'm just going to wipe my board, and then I'll show you the first two paintings next to each other. So both of these are a nice soft diffused reflection. Now we're going to go for a reflection with a hard edge. So I've prepped the paper just as before, and I'm adding the colors just like we did before. Once I have my three colors, I'm going to let the colors dry thoroughly before moving on. Otherwise, they will bleed into the color for the next step. Now that my colors are dry, I'm going to use the same color blue as I used in the previous paintings. I didn't need to mix nearly as much. So I am using a fan brush to start to show you. This is the one, it was an old brush, so I cut some bristles off, just makes it even more effective. And all I'm doing is brushing on either side of each of my colors just to give a broken edge so it's nice and crisp, but it's not a solid line. Now, if you don't have a fan brush or an old brush that you can use, what I tend to do is another technique where I take my brush and I squeeze the belly of the brush just like that, and it spreads out the end of the bristles so they look like a fan brush, and they do the same technique as if you were using a fan brush. I'm adding a bit more down at the bottom because I need it to be darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. So I'm just working it in, and then while it's wet, I'll take the fan brush and work it through. Once you feel you have full coverage, then you can stop. And then I'm gonna, while everything's still wet, do the same technique as before where I dip my hand in my clean water and I flick it, hoping for the paint to bloom and give me little, raindrop effects. I'm just taking my fan brush, just blending in a little bit more where I think I needed a little bit more. I'm also going to take the card, just as before, and I'm going to go up to my vanishing point. But as you notice, I'm having some trouble because the blue has dried much quicker. So what I'm doing is I'm dipping my brush in the water, and when I do that, you'll notice, see, it starts to lift up and it works. And it's nice because it's not a solid line. They're broken, and this makes it more effective. Then I'll take my fan brush again. I'm drying it off, and I'm going to do the texture across again, just so that the lights aren't just bright lines. You need to break them up so that it looks like there's rain hitting them. It's sharper and edgier, but it gives a really nice realistic effect. And then the last step is to use my watered down white gouache. Again, as you see, as I'm putting it on, I tap it against my hand using a liner brush, and it looks like it's white, but when it dries, it becomes transparent. So I'll take the tape off, wipe the board down, and I'm going to put all the paintings somewhere to dry. But first, I'll give you a comparison of the three. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button if you would like to see more of my videos. Be sure to ring the bell if you'd like to get notifications when I post new videos. Thank you for watching.